I've got a lot of hairs to try to split here. We're talking about culture and its relationship to politics. This particular two-part series is called Why Politics Fails Us under the broader rubric of culture. And in the previous video, I talked about how culture and nature are contradictory if you really squeeze them. I prefer to say that they're a paradox because, of course, they're both true, but we can't, with only those two terms, really understand how human society works. We are naturally social, so we naturally create a culture in any circumstances, and yet culture is, by definition, a set of rules that resist the slide, the degeneration that would take place if things were left in the natural state. So again, there's the paradox that human beings naturally don't want to remain natural. You can't keep us natural. We keep creating customs, habits, and of course, these in a political context play right into laws. They're formalized, codified rules. So there's a very tight relationship between culture and politics. Um, you could say in many societies today that in fact culture prescribes law, things that are in the religious code, things that are seen as mandatory behavior because of ancestral wisdom, have essentially are the law of the land as well. We pride ourselves in the West to taking a more objective, rationalist approach, and yet we cannot codify laws that go against our culture. If you just think about it, culture prepares people to endorse or tolerate certain laws. You cannot legislate culture; it runs the other way. Um, so there's an inextricable link between the two. Now, I'm going to try to dispose of this conventional spectrum that poses left at one extreme and right at the other, because I don't think it's very helpful. Typically, the right is said to be the atavistic end. The atavus is the Latin word for a grandfather. An atavist is someone who says, well, I'm doing it because granddaddy did it, and if it was good enough for him, it's good enough for me. So this is a rigid traditionalist. Anything that is habitual is right. I mean, it stood the test of time, so if it's been done for generations, it hasn't destroyed us yet. So there must be something good about it, and there's a certain logic to that, even though, as we've said before, human beings can do things for many generations that are very morally disturbing and even socially destructive. It's amazing what we can get ourselves used to. But that's the extreme right position. There's not really much rationale that's put into it. It's just, well, that's the way things have always been. And sometimes it's tied into a idea of supernatural intervention. This is what we've been handed by God or the gods, so this is the correct way to do it. And a monarchy is a good example of a government that would be far right. On the left, the other extreme would be where anything that's traditional is automatically bad. I mean, that would be the extreme of it. That change in and of itself is always good, because and there is too for this a kind of a rationale. We human beings, with our vast intelligence, can confront any problem and figure out a way to dissolve it or diminish it. So our advance as a culture is just an ongoing series of fixing problems. We first of all fix the big problems, and once we get those fixed, we can address littler problems. And we also, because we get smarter and smarter, and in terms of our own culture, this science would obviously play into this in a big way. As we become more high tech, we address problems at an accelerated rate. So we get into this mindset that I have spoken elsewhere of as future worship. We are idolaters of the future. We don't have any other God, but we feel that the future is going to hold the key to everything that we are, to our purpose. We don't have any other purpose because we've just waved metaphysics aside. Metaphysics it plays into the right wing too much. It makes things too stationary. It gets in the way of change. So we don't have any metaphysical beliefs. We substitute science for that, and science is promising us constant change for every little problem. We even invent new problems as we solve the bigger ones because it always has to be change. I think the thing that frightens us the most is a kind of a panic with regard to stasis, stasophobia, or something like that. We cannot tolerate the idea of just being dead in the water. That would be an extreme leftist position, and it seems to me that both of these, if you put something in the middle of the spectrum, you're going to have a needle that's moving slowly from right to left. You've probably heard a lot of talk on the current scene about the Overton window in our politics that is forever nudging a little bit farther and a little bit farther over toward the left. Uh, the more conservative politicians are always making more and more concessions, and once they do, the more leftist politicians are always demanding more and more concessions. And this is seen by people on the right as an outrage. We got to define our position and stand still. But there is a certain uh, kind of rationale. It doesn't mean that people who are slowly shifting to the left are necessarily being hoodwinked. You could say of the middle that they too are believers, are future worshipers. They just want the change to go a little more slowly. As I believe it was Augustus, this was one of his watchwords, festina lente, make haste slowly. It's okay to, because we honestly, let's face it, everyone in the West and especially in the United States is all about high tech and science and constant change. But if you're a conservative, you believe in slower change. So that is our culture. I mean, we don't have in the United States centuries old cathedrals and museums of paintings that were painted 500 years ago, but what we have is this investment in the idea of change, and it is our culture. That's what we pass on to our children is the belief that things tomorrow are not going to be the way they are today. That's a heck of a legacy to pass on to your children. Again, it's thoroughly paradoxical, but it has a kind of a sense to it. And yet, I don't like this spectrum that you hear virtually universally. Everybody seems to endorse it, but I don't like it because it doesn't address the question, okay, where's the truth? It's kind of a sort of a touchy feely attitudinal kind of approach to analyzing human society. Some people dig in and want to do things just because their ancestors did them, and some people are, come on, let's go. We gotta. I've even heard some people talk about this as a right brain, left brain kind of tug of war. All right, that's a pop cultural explanation, although it has a sort of veneer of psychology to it. But my objection is, can we not just ask the question, where is the truth? We don't want to do things, as I've said several times before. I think we don't want to do things that were done in the past that are morally atrocious. Just because it's been done before doesn't necessarily mean that the traditions that we inherit all have to justify themselves morally, and if they cannot do so, they should be jettisoned, and we should be able to agree on that. Even in societies where human sacrifice was practiced, apparently sometimes, I'm not an expert on Mesoamerica, but the Inca, or the not the Inca, but the Maya and the Aztec, I think, practiced this sacrifice of young girls to the sun god of which I've spoken. And apparently, the young girls were happy to do this, and their families felt honored because it was a great uh, honor. They found these mummified bodies in peat bogs in northwestern Europe, too, where men had been bound up and tossed into the bog. And one can imagine that that was an honor to be selected as an emissary to the gods on the other side. So you can have willing participants in these atrocities. The thing that makes them atrocious isn't that the victims object. The victims themselves may be very upset when you come and set them free. It's, with human beings, it's just one paradox after another. But that doesn't make the culture okay. So traditionalism has to justify its traditions. On the other hand, there's a central problem with this leftist worship of the future too, and one of the problems is simply the practical problem that we human beings don't like to change all the time. It becomes very unnerving to us. We like to be able to go back to our hometown and, see the old football stadium where you ran back the fumble for a touchdown, and you go down Willow Street, and wow, look at how all the trees have grown up. And it makes you feel old, but it makes you feel old in a context that kind of puts life in a box and makes sense of life. And how many of us can actually do that now? We go back to the places where we grew up, and nothing, maybe the names of the streets are the same, but we don't recognize anything on the street. It's all gone. And that's not good for human happiness, for the sense of meaning that humans require. So this maniacal chase after change is almost panicky desperation when we're not changing fast enough that one witnesses in people of the far left is a kind of pathology. Uh, it's the second problem with it is just it's morally disturbing because it uh, shifts, it seems to me, responsibility for problems from yourself to your environment. As we get better and better at solving these problems, the problems that are designated as such seem to me to become more and more things that are really just matters of our attitude, or our ability to be adults and process the world in some grown-up rational fashion. And we don't do it because we feel that we can now micro adjust the environment so that these problems will go away. If someone calls us a name that we don't like, we start buzzing about uh, racism or sexism or whateverism. It's now a social malaise, and it's not just our own inability to absorb a childish slur that somebody launched at us. That's kind of pathetic, and it's a moral problem. It's a problem with people who cannot seem to become adults and turn the corner. So we find that I think at both extremes we run into uh, societies that are not healthy. They're not functioning well. Uh, Further ironies as I wind this up. Uh, the right, which is supposed to be traditional in our society, is the advocate of constantly tearing things down and putting up new things. Talked about the hometown that you go to, and maybe the street names are the same, but nothing else is standing. Well, that's because of jobs. That's because of the economy. We've we're expanding. We're creating more wealth. That's what we do on the right. Well, we certainly don't preserve traditions, do we? You don't even know where the heck you are anymore if you left town for 10 years. And the left, the uh, outpost of tree huggers, which seems to be, I mean, why suddenly we want to preserve our forests and our natural environment. Everything else is supposed to be changing, but everything in nature is supposed to stay the same. And this is just a complete flip flop of mentalities. Why does the left practically want to live in loincloths and in hunter-gatherer societies, and the right wants to uh, take a beautiful waterfall and make it into Six Flags over Rainbow Falls or something? I mean, it's just we don't we're so inconsistent, and it's so insane that just have to say these terms and this spectrum, to me, they don't mean anything anymore. I'm just going to leave off by saying I, I think that we have two what have to be unconditional moral principles here. And this is kind of an antinomy because they imply a contradiction. One is that I've already said moral atrocity cannot hide behind culture. Saying that something is just the traditional way that your ancestors have always done it, if it's wrong, it's wrong. Culture doesn't sanitize that. And a second, what I think is an absolute, is that cultural upheaval cannot be forced on those who choose to retain the past just for the sake of change, just because you know what's right and you're sure you do. You're like Moses coming down from the mountain. You've figured out what the perfect society is. You're going to go in and turn this society inside out because they're doing some bad things. They really need you to fly in like Superman and change it all. Uh, you cannot force a culture to completely change its traditional ways just because you have the light and you know what's best. That's morally obnoxious too. If people in the society, maybe they're doing something wrong, but they have to recognize it themselves and embrace by free choice the idea of a change, or their behavior is being forced upon them and it's no longer a moral choice. So even if you make them change the behavior, they're doing it unwillingly. Not only do they have in their confused hearts the love of the old corrupt ways, but now there's a kind of martyrdom associated with them, and they resent you because you came in and changed everything. And by the way, uh, what does that say about your own moral state, that you are so confident that you can become a dictator to other people, and you can broadcast to them that you should be doing things another way? But I'm talking about where we actually roll in with tanks and make everybody live a different way. So we have a contradiction here, it seems. If it's wrong for a culture to harbor moral atrocity, and yet it's wrong for another culture to ride in there and overhaul the corrupt culture, then how do we sort this out? And that's where I would like to begin with part two of this two-part video.